Friends. Welcome back to Gender as an Agency of Social Stratification, Part 2. In our Part 1, we tried to understand how the concept of choice is not freely available to all the genders, and we had basically spoken about a binary in terms of the masculine and the feminine gender. And we showed that how the structures, the institutions have fettered the feminine gender in terms of making choices. Today we'll go a step ahead. We'll also see how the notion of time is also something which is very much gendered. These two lectures would be a passage through which I am primarily trying to put across that gender indeed is based on inequities and therefore stratification. Gender is not just about differences, it's about arrangement of these differences in a hierarchy. And to most of the urban literati, this comes as yet another lecture on femininity, yet another lecture on some female empowerment. But this is actually not what it is all about. It is about a reality check, which is happening within our own households. However, we actually tend to overlook it. We tend to see it as something which is commonsensical. So in today's lecture, I will be bringing to light a reference by Thompson, and this work is by E.P. Thompson. In E.P. Thompson's essay, Time, Work, Discipline and Industrial Capitalism, ways in which the fundamental character of time in modern society changed post-capitalism has been very well discussed. The period in discussion is between 1300 to 1650, when the factory workers were required to maintain a clear distinction between what was their time and employers' time, or which was seen to be paid time. So this particular reference which I am putting across is a reference which was introduced to me through my lectures on NPTEL. In fact, even the previous lecture, I have received a lot of inputs from my lecture series on SWAM MOOC channels NPTEL, and I would encourage all of you to go through them. So this particular text is basically a text which is located in a socio-economic background which was undergoing change due to industrial capitalism. So we are basically trying to arrest and investigate those changes which took place in the life of the workers and their families post-capitalism. So that is why it is attaching a particular importance to a period of late 19th century. So, as I just shared, that it is trying to maintain a clear distinction between their own time, as in workers' own time, and employers' time, which was seen as something which was a paid time. Thompson is suggesting that this understanding of time itself has a relatively recent history, and that it has to do with the advent of industrial capitalism, as I just shared with you, where we separate work from pleasure. So, work indeed is seen as a separate time or temporality than pleasure. The two cannot be merged together. This separation has converted time into a surveillance mechanism. So when you are under pleasure, when you are enjoying, at that point of time, there is no surveillance on you. However, when you are working, there is a surveillance. So just as in your classrooms, you have a fixed timetable, you have a discipline, there's a bell which is ringing, there is a punching in, punching out. So it acts as a surveillance mechanism. In this context, Thompson states that time is now currency. It is not passed but spent. The term spent highlights a clear relationship between time and its valuation through money. For Thompson, the transition to mature industrial society entails a restructuring of working habits. Now, what does he mean by restructuring of working habits? By restructuring of working habits, he means that people go from home to factory. There is a physical separation between the place of pleasure, which in most cases is the home, and the place of work, which in most cases is factory. Over a period of time, we start internalizing this time discipline lest we face punishments, fines, penalties. So I'm sure you're trying to understand the imagery which Thompson has tried to create. And through this imagery, it is very important to understand that the notion of time is linear. What do I mean by the notion of time is linear? It means that 1 minute follows the other. Every hour follows the other. If we look closely at this, does it not suggest that this very idea of time and linearity is far more suitable for masculinity than femininity? And why do I say that? Let me put it across through an illustration. One wakes up in the morning, takes his breakfast, goes to work, and then comes back home. The entire day is clearly divided into exclusive and clearly demarcated time slots. This kind of luxury is not available to feminine subjects. Linearity distracts from the existence a multitude of experiences of time. And here I would like to showcase a tweet put across by Anand Mahendra, in which if you will see that if the goal is meritocracy, then there are so many obstacles in front of a female participant, unlike the male participants. And it is these obstacles which should be read as multitude of experiences. So, to repeat, linearity distracts from the existence a multitude of experiences. I'm sure you are able to locate through this particular picture a multitude of experiences of time. For a woman, a moment in time is interrupted by multiple things: demands of children, demands of aging parents, demands of domesticity, all of which have to be balanced with demands at work. And therefore, their time is never a given moment and at time. And this is why I say that this very notion of linearity is far more suitable for masculinity than femininity. Because in case of masculinity, when one wakes up in the morning, one exclusively wakes up in the morning. But for femininity, when she wakes up in the morning, she's half awake with a cup of coffee, working on the clothes, dumping it in the machine, putting something on the gas stove, calling out to children to wake up, possibly to husband to go and water the plants, and n number of things. So this multiplicity is very essential component of femininity. So therefore, for a woman, a moment in time is interrupted by multiple things, various demands, all of which have to be beautifully balanced with demands at work, and therefore their time is never a given moment of time. That's why in the previous lecture, that's part one, I said the choice was never available to her as a free choice. That was choice which was interrupted, which was a fettered choice. So sadly, gender theories of time speak about time given to work as, and here I would like to put it across, time given to work as the only time that is valuable. So domesticity has no space at all, space in terms of value. And how is this value being adjudged? It is being adjudged in material terms. So none of the gender theories of time are speaking about time as if the time that which is spent on work is the only time which is valuable. The time away from work is seen as free time and carries no value, will not be remunerated. To put these things a little better, let me weave out for you another illustration. And this illustration is from a text which we had read in our previous lecture also. And from this particular text by Christina Hughes, I am taking out a quick case study titled Time and the Weaving of the Strands of Everyday Life. This is a beautiful case study, and it's available for all of you to read this as I read it out for you. So, this is an case study where Christina Hughes is trying to illustrate how time should be seen in terms of women and work. So I read, Davis' 1990 study provides a phenomenological account of how gender relations of time were instrumental in shaping the lives and actions of a group of 40 Swedish women who constantly moved in and moved out of labor market. Now pause. This particular couple of lines or case study is now becoming doubly interesting. Why? Because Sweden or Scandinavian countries are often touted as great models of gender equality and egalitarianism. So over here, it's important to pay attention to how time continues to be apprehended in similar fashion, even in seemingly egalitarian situations. And so I continue. Davis's explores women's everyday lives in terms of employment, unemployment, home, and community. These women were studied for a period of 2.5 to 3 years, and in-depth interviews were carried out during this period. Pause. Now, this is also what we would call a longitudinal study, which means that we are tracking them across large time periods, trying to understand in what ways their lives may have moved or not in a linear, progressive fashion. I continue. Davis's analysis illustrates how women's everyday lives are bound up with and directed by both clock and process time consciousness. Now, this is very essential. Clock is what we have just discussed, the linear time. While the process time is very interesting. Linear time, clock time is where 1 minute follows the other. Process time is a little bit more fluid and dynamic. It takes into account contingencies, happenstance, accidents, life events, all of those that make up the everyday life, especially of a woman. And Davis concludes that women's lives have to do also with the process time consciousness. For example, women's experiences of time when working in the home are bound up with the times of family members and others through which clock and process time weave complicated patterns. There is always something else going on in the same moment. Women, of course, juggled the demands of employment and family care. Wives and husbands work different shifts to ensure that one is always available for childcare. And we need to pause here. So here you do see that wives and husbands are working together to do this, but which means that the notion of time is still gendered, because husband's times for childcare is always that which is left over from work. And when women were not in paid employment, and I continue, when women were not in paid employment, their time was given up to the time demands of the other. So, in other words, the free time that is part of a linear time model is never free for women. There is no time to take off. There is no time for relaxation. The time has to be given into the demands of the others, which is not accounted for within employment or paid employment at all. So it's a very interesting case study, and in fact, another illustration to follow in the light of the fact that history too is gendered. You know, we need to understand this. In fact, this is something that you could read once you go through this particular YouTube lecture. I will skip this particular continuation of the case study and move on to the fact that what new historicism is all about, and history is also very what do I say, shrewdly gendered. Be that be Renaissance or other reforms, be that be fiction or theatre, women's voices, you all would agree, were really rarely heard. The kind of literature in history and cultural studies that addresses the need to recover women's voices is often spoken about as new historicism. In other words, through sociological imagination today, let us try and uncover how history, texts, fiction, all are manipulated. They suggest things, plots, and events as if they are woven in common sense. However, when we analyze, restructure, and deconstruct them through a gender lens, we can observe a gendered ideology smuggled into it. And as another illustration, let us read one of another beautiful works. And this work is titled The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, which gives us a completely different apprehension of women's bodies, linearity, and time. And in this sociological excavation, a very important figure to medical knowledge would be revealed to us. And the excerpt that I will be taking out for all of you is an excerpt put across by Rebecca Skloot in a magazine called Discover. And I have picked up this particular review, which is there on the screen for you. It's basically an excerpt from the review of the book made by Rebecca to tell you what it is about. And I'm reading simultaneously. Look in any biomedical laboratory and you will find HeLa cells. Over 50 million tons of these cells have been grown in churning vats of liquid all over the world, pushing forward our understanding of cancer and other diseases, and underpinning the polio vaccine, IVF, cloning, and more. In early 1951, there was only one place in the world where HeLa cells could be found. The cervix of a poor black tobacco farmer called Henrietta Lacks. She was treated for cervical cancer at Johns Hopkins Hospital, where, without her knowledge or consent, doctors took some cells from her tumor and cultured them. They became HeLa, the immortal line of cells that would change the world. Henrietta died the same year. Her family only learned of her immortality. Immortality. This is very interesting. More than 20 years later, when scientists started using them in research, again, without informed consent to better understand Henrietta cells. Now, here it is important to remember that this dying woman was not considered individual enough for her name to be even properly announced to the world as somebody that gave these cells that allowed for medical understanding. And I'm sure most of you were unaware of this fact, as was I before I pursued NPTEL. Here, we only valorize a notion of time, where bodies come and bodies go. but scientific knowledge progresses along a spectrum that we must pay attention to. Unfortunately, it is a highly masculinist notion of time, which does not take into account the voices that help it along the way. Actually, this example is also a marvelous account of cyclicity, where after so very many years, thanks to this kind of a writing, this kind of a discussion, thanks to this kind of a recovery, we now know the story of Henrietta Lacks. And we have a figure to be able to deepen our understanding of medical knowledge and medical progress. Thus, through the two paths, I have tried to put across how gender indeed is an agency of social stratification and not just of differences. In our next lecture, which is going to be part 3 lecture, I'm going to be focusing primarily on third gender, going beyond the binary between the masculine and the feminine. So we began with the elimination of sex and gender binary, where we realize that the two are actually not distinct, but they have been fused. They appear as codes. They appear as if they are given, but actually they are performative. And over a period of time, we have understood that it is not just that the sex and gender are fused and cultured, but also gender is not about heteronormativity exclusively. It should also be inclusive of homosexuality. It should also give space to the third gender. So thank you so much. God bless you all. And once again, with a request to subscribe to my YouTube channel so that you consistently receive notifications, and also to follow me on the blog so that whatever we discuss, whatever we speak, whatever I put across, it is available to you as notes there in that particular blog. I'm sure you would by now have realized that gender is not just something which is given, but also something which has to be learned. So again, goodbye.